Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is sponsored by Codify, a California benefit corporation. Visit Codify at www.codifi.com.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs, no we don't.
Welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, episode 64. I'm your host, Sara Head, with my co-hosts today, Ken Fader and Jeb Card. Today we're talking about why it's important that the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast exists. We're reintroducing you to our goals of presenting actual archaeological facts to counter all of the archaeological nonsense that's out there. Get ready to think critically.
Digging in a trench, monuments, going to the pub when the day is spent. Funny beady blokes you will see are a staple of archaeology.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast. I am your host, Sara, and I am here today with my co-hosts, Ken Fader. How's it doing?
Happy New Year, Sara and Jeb.
And Jeb Card is with me tonight, too.
Yep, it's 2017, so 2016 can't kill anybody else.
This is also true.
It's an Archaeological Fantasies threesome.
For the new year.
Yeah, look out.
We got to keep those odd numbers going in the odd years.
Yes.
It is also, being as this is the first podcast we are recording in 2017, we are officially a 2-year-old podcast.
I think that means temper tantrums.
It does. It means temper tantrums.
Absolutely.
I've learned the word no. I'm going to repeat it frequently. Ken, how are you going to express your terrible twos?
It's past the point that we should be potty trained, I think, at this point. But we could be obstreperous about that.
We can still have accidents.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we should start thinking about individual shows as accidents. Yes.
Yeah, there's at least one I can think of. Anyway. So, you guys, since it's our second year on the air and it's a brand new year, I thought maybe it would be good for our audience, especially for people who are maybe just finding us for the first time. I don't know where they've been for 2 years, but
God, come on.
If you're just listening to the Archaeological Fantasies podcast for the first time, I thought maybe we could go over kind of the goals and the purpose of this show as we laid it out 2 years ago, and how that's kind of changed over the last 2 years, because we have grown and matured somewhat as a podcast.
I'm not sure about that last adjective, but continue.
Well, we at least brought Jeb on. I mean, that's a sign, right?
Again, not with the maturation.
Well, I thought Jeb's on the show because his parole officer makes him go on the show.
Is this community service?
Yeah, isn't that community service for you, Jeb?
As an employee of the state, I can neither confirm nor deny anything that's been described in the last 20 seconds.
That's awesome.
So your legal counsel recommends that you not answer that question.
Hang on a second. Yes, that is precisely what they said.
I don't think you can plead the fifth on podcasts. I don't think that stands. So the Archaeological Fantasies podcast was originally started, like I said, 2 years ago with just Ken and I at that point, and we both saw a hole that needed to be filled in the podcasting universe, where two intelligent people would get together and discuss odd aspects of pseudo-archaeology and the fringe community and come up with logical, rational, and well thought out arguments against them.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea for a podcast, Sara.
Yeah,
that's what we're doing. Never mind.
Yes.
And then Ken and I got hired to do the show. But yeah, no, I think we've stuck with that for the most part.
Yeah.
We've had a lot of fun with it.
They couldn't find the intelligent people they were looking for, so we got we got the job instead.
Now we drug in Ken because Ken is, believe it or not, a rock star in archaeology, which cracks me up every time we have a host on, a guest on. And they're like, oh yeah, Ken Fader, I love him.
Archaeology, that's a great, I like the phrasing.
Yeah.
I am always, I don't know why, but it always makes me giggle when I have a guest on and they're like, oh yeah, I love Ken Fader. I followed everything he's written. He's the whole reason that I'm into Fringe. Whoa, I'm
that's
like,
great. They don't know the truth about me.
Right? And then like I send
me for a little bit, you learn the truth.
And then I'm like, yeah, and then I'm also a co-host. Like, oh yeah, that's great. Thanks. Screw you.
Of course, I met Jeb. It was 2012, right, Jeb, at the SAAs?
Oh, there you go.
No, well, we were at the SAA, but also at the Sunwatch. You had come to give a talk, I believe, on Ancient Aliens as part of the AIA series that year. They sort of themed them to weird shit because of the 2012 business. And you went to the Sunwatch in Ohio, which is about an hour from my house.
It's a wonderful place, really wonderful facility.
Sounds nice.
And I'm going to be doing something similar, not the same organization, something similar at, I believe, Fort Ancient later this year, although I'm not sure that's all been announced.
Very cool. Yeah, that was, very briefly, at the end of my presentation at Sunwatch, Brad Lepper, well-known archaeologist in Ohio, presented me with a replica of one of the Newark Holy Stones, which we did an episode about. And I was only in Ohio briefly, so I only brought carry-on luggage. And they actually tagged me when the luggage went through the scanner and they saw one of the Newark Holy Stones. They pulled it out and they demanded that I explain what in the world this was. And so I said, well, it's kind of a funny story. And I started giving them the Newark Holy Stones lecture. And it was in the Dayton airport, which is a really swell airport. All the TSA people came around. One young woman took out a pad and said, do you mind if I take notes?
That's awesome.
So she was taking notes about this. And they gave it back to me, and I put it away. And one of the TSA agents said, this is Dayton. Nothing interesting ever happens here. This was the best thing that's ever happened in the airport.
I like the Dayton airport. My last 2 times have been out of CVG, but I like the Dayton airport.
I don't fly.
One of my favorite airports, I think, it was Milwaukee, where after you go through the security and your belt is off and your shoes are off, they have a sign that says the recombobulation area.
Nice.
I actually photographed it because it was like, that's perfect.
That's awesome.
That's pretty awesome.
Well, at least they're honest about it.
But yeah, no, we met there, and then we did do the SAA session later that year.
And Jeb and Dave Anderson edited the volume based on those papers and on a number of others. Jeb, you want to give a little shout out to your book?
Yeah, well, we've had, and the thing is, and so now since we are treating this as kind of like if you've not listened before,
right?
We ended up having a lot of the people in that effort, like David Anderson, like April Besaw, like Stacey Dunn, like Chris Begley.
It's really the reason. It's really the reason why we had Jeb come on the show is so that we could just slowly milk the book for all of the guests in it.
That's right.
Not entirely inaccurate. But we put together this decent edited volume, very good edited volume in my opinion, being the lead editor. That covers a lot of different case studies and perspectives. Ken did the discussion on it, and that's Lost City Found Pyramid, Alternative Archaeology and Pseudoscientific Practices. And I think some of the things that we're going to talk about today are addressed by a number of authors in one way or another in that volume.
And even just today, a friend of mine sent me a link to an article in the New Yorker about the Mosquito Coast, the discovery of this lost civilization in Honduras. And Begley did a paper about this controversy at the 2012 SAAs, and his article is in the book.
Yes,
and it still exists. This is something that's ongoing, and the people are reacting to this gross misrepresentation of what's going on.
And if you want to learn more about that, about the Petch, the Tawaka, the Mosquito, and the claims about this Ciudad del Jaguar or Ciudad Blanca or the lost city of the monkey god, all these various names have been given to this myth. go back and listen in our catalog to the episode with Chris Begley, who, by the way, was one of our most amazing guests.
He was. I really enjoyed having him on. He was very cool.
Yeah. He is a fantastic scientist and a fantastic interview, and I strongly recommend, if you've not gone and listened to that one, you go pull that one out of the archives, folks.
So if you're...
In fact...
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that if you read about this controversy, a lot of the other scholars mention Chris's name and say, he's the guy who has done all of this work that was ignored by these folks saying, oh, we've discovered some fabulous new site.
Yeah, he did his dissertation there. He was, of course, but as many will point out, there have been archaeologists from outside working there for decades, like Herbert Spindon and Doris Stone. And then, as Chris very much and pointedly pointed out, he didn't discover these sites. He mapped them for academic purposes. Every single one of them he was shown by local Petch people.
Right.
This is their backyard.
Mm-hmm.
So, but anyway, you can hear more about that on that show.
Okay, so if you're still a little confused as to what the point of this podcast is, we really do look at pseudo-archaeological claims, and we try to pick them apart and find the logic behind them. And at the same time, we're trying to teach you a little bit about what real archaeology would do with something like this, what real archaeologists would expect to find if something like that were real. Taking the Lost City, for example, we would expect to find quite a bit of garbage, maybe some buildings and maybe artifacts that were leading us there. But as Jeb mentioned, people have known that these locations have been there pretty much as long as they've been there because these people are native to that area. So it's just kind of looking at the logic of what is already there and helping you put together your own thoughts on it. Yeah. And hopefully guiding you away from the fringe and more towards the rational way of thinking.
Yeah. And I think a major thing underlying this is that you're listening to three people who are passionately interested in the human past. And we take personal offense when people misrepresent what the actual archaeological record tells us about that past. So it's not just that we want to debunk bad stuff. We want to explain why we know these things, why there are ancient aliens didn't build the pyramids, or why ancient Phoenicians didn't build Mystery Hill, or why there really isn't a lost city in Honduras. We want you to understand how we know that, and then we talk about real archaeological sites in this podcast as well, and explain how we actually solve the mysteries about human past.
Yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of amazing things that we know and amazing things that we're still trying to find out that are, in fact, mysteries, are, in fact, questions. And we know that people are interested in stuff that seems glamorous and sensational. And actually, one of my critiques of professional archaeology, and we've talked about this on the show, and it's a thing I write about a lot, is we sometimes purposely make things dull because it makes us feel more professional. I think that that's foolish. And I think one of the ways, and this is something I think we're going to get to as the show progresses today, to deal with this increasing tidal wave of, frankly, as we've used the word before, bullshit, is to realize that we've got really cool stories to tell, and sometimes we should be kind of excited and talk about how there's things we don't know, or the things we know are pretty nuts. And so, for example, we talked in a previous episode about the fact that there were friggin' hobbits, that there were very small people in Indonesia in the Pleistocene, and how people have spun stories that are not true. But there's also like really cool stories about them that are true. And we covered all of that, as well as how the media screws these sorts of things up.
I want to point something out here for those of you who have not listened to our show before, that from the time it took for one of us to say bullshit, that's about the longest stretch we've ever encountered. Usually we get to that a long time before Jeb just did. So just
and usually it's Ken.
Fact.
I'm teaching an online course this semester, so a lot of it is done through web pages and other kinds of content, and I have been linking to our show. But every time that I do have to put on, by the way, there's a good chance that there's some not safe for work language here, so please be aware of that.
So do you put a parental advisory sticker on every one of the podcasts?
I think we on our iTunes we do have the explicit marker. So yes,
We don't swear
yes.
that much.
Well, hey, listen.
Not always. We don't. Just sometimes.
Whenever I lecture about Stonehenge, I always provide students with a link to the YouTube of the duo Ylvis. Yes. Got this wonderful music video about Stonehenge, but I always warn the students there is some rough language and a little bit of sexual innuendo. So if that bothers you, don't watch it. But I don't feel secure enough, even with tenure, to show it in class. Because that's the last thing I need is somebody bitching about, oh my God, there's some sexual content.
Yeah, well, I make it clear, given that, the thing with an online course is everything is right there in black and white.
Oh, so you bet.
It makes me think about this, which is actually interesting. But anyway, I don't want to get into that.
Sure.
Too much like work.
Okay, so what people are taking away at this point is that we like to talk and we swear, and sometimes we talk about archaeology.
That seems these seems like our strengths.
This is true.
This is yeah.
I would like to. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Jeb.
Well, I think the thing that we are trying to actually get to is, all right, let's just get to it. There has been, all right, so when you guys brought me on,
yes,
and we brought me on as a co-host,
and we brought you on last year, so you've been with us about half the time that the podcast has been on the air. So,
right, and before that, I was a guest several times, and I brought the high class that I bring to everything. So you had me on about the lost continent of Mu that doesn't exist. You had me on about Roswell.
Roswell, yeah.
But the first time I was brought on, and I'm going somewhere with this. It's not just entirely self-adulation. The first time you guys brought me on was to talk about how there's a lot of weird things out there. There's sort of what you guys called the fringe of the fringe. And there's a 2-part episode where I talk about this. And one of my messages that kind of I think came through loud and clear, and it's one I've continued on as a co-host, is there is a lot of weird things out there. There's frankly far more people that believe it than you might expect. And it ties into the political, and it ties into how we discuss what we do in public and how it's not always going the way we want. Well, 2016 I had a few things to say about that in terms of accuracy in media. This new phrase, which I think is driving everybody who's ever been involved with the skeptical movement before crazy, of fake news. A lot of the things that we talk about, I think, are frankly more relevant than they have ever been. As weird as that may sound, even though we're talking about UFOs, and we've talked about genetics of strange ideas and angel DNA, it's actually more relevant than it's ever been. And I think that's one of the things we kind of want to get across in this show.
Sure. And what's interesting too is that, and we've mentioned some of these in the podcast, this whole fake news thing. It certainly seems to have reached a crescendo now, but it's not brand new.
No.
We have a newspaper article in Arizona claiming that there's an ancient civilization hidden away in the Grand Canyon, and it was an entirely fake article, not presented as fake, but presented as the real deal. And even folks who were involved in putting it together said, no, it was just for entertainment purposes. It doesn't make any difference. People are still talking about that as a real thing. And it's just sort of frightening, because back then, a newspaper article in some small paper in Arizona would generate interest just so far. But now with the internet, these things travel around the world instantaneously. And how does the truth ever catch up to it?
Yeah. Well, when we did the Moose Show, I brought up the article in the New York American by Paul Schliemann, the descendant of Heinrich Schliemann, that helped create the lost continent of Mu, and frankly plays into things like UFOs and all that. Problem is, he never existed. The entire thing was made up out of basically plagiarism of H. Rider Haggard's novel She, and whatever they knew about Heinrich Schliemann they had lying around the newspapers in 1912 at the New York American. So yeah, it's not new at all.
No, it's not. And as Ken was saying, and Jeb hit on this as well, once that crap's out there, it's impossible to catch it all. I mean, this podcast does I feel like this podcast does a really great job of catching this stuff and trying to, explain why that's not right and try to give you the correct answer, or at least lead you towards reason. But, once it's out there, it's out there. You got your crazy uncle who's repeating it. I mean, I've got people that, believe there are mer people that live under the ocean. They believe this. So
well, they believe it without the secret evidence to which some of us are privy.
Right. Thanks, Jeb. But yeah, no, it's just like that, though. I mean, once they have the belief in their mind, it's almost impossible to change it. And when you have joke articles going out without indicators that it's a joke, it causes problems. And then you compound that with an archaeological community that, as Jeb said, sometimes just likes to talk in big words because it makes us feel fancy.
Yeah.
And I think all three of us are fairly critical about that particular habit. It's a compounding issue that just kind of grows and gets worse.
The quote that came to mind, this website says it's Winston Churchill. A lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to get its pants on.
Yeah.
And that's the 1930s or 40s with a level of technology that is far less than what we have today to disseminate information.
Right.
So now it's like the lie gets around the world 20 times before the truth has a chance to get its pants on. And that's something that we have to deal with. All science has to deal with. But certainly in archaeology, this is an issue that is, well, it provides one of the reasons for the existence of this podcast.
Well, and it repeats itself too. As you were saying, you're
right.
hearing about this lost civilization in Honduras, and Chris Begley talked about that in 2012. I mean, Jeb's brought up the meteorite dagger that was found with King
Tutankhamun.
Yeah, and I know Jeb has encountered that at least a few years before the email that we're talking about this moment. The 10 most mysterious ancient artifacts, which is how I founded my blog. It was going over each one of these 10 artifacts, which are not artifacts and not mysterious. That thing still goes through my email box every once in a while.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, and it's been around forever.
Yeah, the glass pyramids of Atlantis off of Cuba that were supposedly detected by remote sensing. I've seen that one just about be discovered for at least 12 years.
Right. I mean, these things they have legs. They keep coming back.
No, to be fair, they're glass, so they're very hard to see underwater.
Right. But not hard to run into. Yeah. Do people just pass over them? How does that work exactly?
It helps that they don't exist. That's actually that's the main issue. So
it's easy not to hit something when it's not really there.
Well, of course, yeah.
So why don't we take a break, and when we come back, let's kind of get into the meat of one of these reoccurring topics that we keep hitting on.
This podcast is sponsored by Ramp. Are you the decision maker in your company? Consider this. For the first time in decades, there's a better option for a corporate card and spend management platform. Meet Ramp, the only corporate card and spend management system designed to help you spend less money so you can make more. With Ramp, you get full visibility into your company's spending and control who spends what with each vendor. Ramp's software collects and verifies receipts instantly to save your team valuable time. Ramp automates data entry and routine tasks with automated approvals, expense categorization and bill payments, time-consuming tasks. Which means you'll stop wasteful spending and close your books in hours instead of days. Businesses that use Ramp add up to 5% to their bottom line the first year. If you're a decision maker, adding Ramp could be one of the best decisions you've ever made. Get $250 when you join Ramp for free. Just go to ramp.com/easy. Ramp.com/easy. RAMP.com/easy.
Cards issued by Sutton Bank and Celtic Bank, members of FDIC. Terms and conditions apply.
Ready to level up your career? Text DISH to 44043 now to dive into a world of exciting technician opportunities at DISH. From cutting-edge technology to a supportive work environment, DISH offers the perfect platform for your success. Connect with us today to discover how you can be part of a dynamic team driving innovation. Connect today and join the DISH family, where innovation meets opportunity. Text DISH to 44043 to kickstart your journey towards a rewarding career.
And we are back. And Ken, you had a thought?
Well, yeah, we don't deal with cryptozoology too much on the show. We have, But to kind of as a lead in, there's a show that's still on Animal Planet called Finding Bigfoot.
Oh yeah, that
and
is
it's been
still
on. How many years has Finding Bigfoot been on? Is it like 7 or 8 years now?
It's something like that. And we used to do. We at one point had the cryptozoology drinking game because I kept bringing that shit up.
Yes.
Okay, but Jeb had a cryptozoology drinking game.
I will own up to that entirely.
My point is
almost 6 years. Almost 6 years.
All right. Well, it's been on almost 6 years. It's called Finding Bigfoot, but they haven't found the goddamn Bigfoot. So by rights, they should change the name of the show to Not Finding Bigfoot, because that's what they do. But that's kind of symptomatic of all this. The fact that these things keep showing up, these claims made about the human past, show up again and again and again. There's nothing new to these things. The evidence is always lacking, and yet it's brought up over and over and over again, which I think leads us to a discussion of Jason, our colleague Jason Colavito's blog from yesterday?
From the first.
Yeah, the first, talking about all of the stuff made, all the claims made in the name of human antiquity over the course of 2016, these earth-shaking, amazing new discoveries that turned out to be nothing whatsoever.
Yeah. He has named it. Let's see where we are. Look back in anger, ring in the new year, which of course is a reference to Bowie. Ring in the new year with a recap of 2016 in French history. Now he normally does this every year. I went back and read his last year, and you're right, Ken. It's the same stuff.
It's the same shit.
The quantity of same stuff, though,
is greater, right?
It is way greater. It is. There is a definite, and I'll come back to why I think there may be something to that. But yeah, the quantity got bigger and bigger and bigger as the year went to some degree.
It's not like 2016. We see an abundance of brand new claims made about human antiquity. It's the same shit we've heard over and over and over again. And we'll certainly supply a link to Jason's blog of the first. But what's interesting is he just lists case after case after case where this is what the claim was. Here's how they said they were going to prove it. And in each case, it's what they had. There's nothing. There's no evidence. They just simply didn't prove what they say they were going to prove. And and these are claims that show up again and again and again. At what point do people wise up and say, well, I guess there's no evidence because it simply isn't true or isn't accurate?
Well, here's something interesting that I've noticed. And so I was recently sent a copy of Frank Joseph's most recent book, which is The Lost History of Ancient America. And it's an edited volume of articles that have already been posted in the Ancient American magazine. And building off of what Ken was saying, you would think at some point with all this lack of evidence, somebody would go, hey, wait a minute, the emperor's wearing no clothes. The way that these articles are written, they do not require evidence for them to be true. This is a theme throughout the entire book. Mm-hmm. The author of whatever article will simply say, this is true. And you are just expected to accept it. They don't even attempt to provide you with actual evidence of any variety. They don't cite anything. They don't do anything that you would logically think to do in order to support an argument. They literally will just say, I'm a professor of physics at Brigham Young, and I say horses are from America, that someone came over before the Spanish and brought horses back to America. I have no proof of this, but that's what I say happened, and therefore it is true. And that's it. That's what almost every article in that book is like. They don't...
Do a lot of them bounce off of text? Because that's been my experience. I mean, the Ancient Aliens and the other shows and all the things, they often will show you like the stones of Pumapunka, and then you actually watch these things or you read these things, and 9 times out of 10, most what they're actually interested in is just illustrating stuff they're getting from mythological texts and historical texts.
They don't even really reference stuff. If they do reference it, it's in an incredibly vague way.
Okay.
that I've been writing rebuttals, and I've been doing this as an exercise for myself, where I've been writing rebuttals on each article as it comes up, which requires a phenomenal amount of research just to find what they're talking about, let alone if what they're claiming it says actually is said. And that's the way they like it. They keep it vague. They hear, and I can only guess that they've like heard secondhand that there was something that happened. Or like in the case of one of the articles I'm reading, I'm 90% sure she just read an article from the Daily Mail and then wrote an article about that article for Ancient America. And that's the only reference she has. And it's very clearly, she's got her little footnote, and there's a little footnote in the back of the book. But that's it. There's no attempt to find the academic paper. There's no attempt to contact the researchers. There's no attempt to look at the actual artifact assemblage, which this woman claims to be a professional archaeologist. So all of these things should be accessible to her at some level. And there does not appear to be any attempt to do any of that aside from reading a Daily Mail article and then just citing that as fact. And it's absolutely acceptable.
But what's terrifying about that is, and I don't want to descend into politics, but when you have individuals who will remain nameless saying, well, I heard that a bunch of Muslims were on rooftops in New Jersey on 9/11 cheering as the towers came down, that's repeated, and there's no source for that other than, well, I saw it somewhere, and then somebody else repeats it, and somebody else repeats it.
It's exactly what it is.
It sort of exactly is the same thing.
It's exactly what it is. It's fascinating to look at, and it's horrifying to process, because you are reading what is being passed off, because Joseph claims for this to be akin to an academic book, this book of his that he has published. And not only is it just as good as an academic book, but it's even more simplified, and the evidence inside of it is even more incontrovertible than actual archaeological science. And all this book does is just say, this is real. That's all it is. It's just an article saying, this is my thought is real, therefore it is real. And that's the argument.
Are you writing a review of this, Sarah?
I am.
Yeah, I saw your first. We had two pieces. You had the very intro, and then I saw the one you put up recently. I think you put it up yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, I know we've talked about the whole not being reactionary thing, but I feel like I want to do this personally just because I want to know more about this particular branch of the fringe, which, if people don't know who Frank Joseph is, I'll put a link.
You already linked to it in the article. I noticed that.
Yeah, but I'll put a link up for our listeners in the show notes to get an idea of who Frank Joseph is. But
Andy White has a fact page.
He does, and that's probably what I'll link to, honestly. But he is very invested in the Book of Mormon and proving the Book of Mormon to be factually true, and so are all of the people who are part of this book.
Well, is Wayne May the publisher? Wayne May is the editor of Ancient American Magazine, and he is, in fact, he's a Mormon, but not kind of a standard mainstream Mormon. He's at an extreme,
right?
That accepts hyperdiffusionism and lots of evidence all over the country for Levites or Nephites being in the New World.
Wayne May did not edit the volume. Frank Joseph is the editor of the volume.
Right, no, but
I think it's Wayne May's.
Is he the publisher?
I think he's the publisher of the book. So it's all interconnected back to the Ancient American Magazine, because they are both. Frank Joseph was a past editor, at least he claims that's what he was, and Wayne May is the current editor of the magazine. So I mean, this all comes back around, but it's fascinating as an anthropologist to look at this group of people, and I always thought they were a smaller group of people than they appear to be, who will just accept something because you said it was true. You don't even have to prove it's true. You just have to say it is, and they'll just accept it. And once your brain has accepted a fact, or what you think is a fact, correcting that in your brain is like immensely difficult.
Yeah, this brings up something else. We were discussing this before we went on the air, which is the question: has the size of the size of the population of people who embrace the fringe in archaeology or in any other field, is it growing? In the past, I've done student surveys in which usually at least the plurality of students say, I don't know. You ask them, do you agree or disagree with the statement that there was a lost continent of Atlantis that's a tremendous impact on human history? And a small percentage agree strongly, a small percentage disagree strongly, and that a lot of the folks, the plurality, sometimes the majority, are in the middle saying, well, I don't know, I've heard of that, but I don't know. And that's usually been the case when you talk about ancient aliens, you talk about Atlantis, you talk about King Tut's curse, that we have all these fence sitters, these people saying, well, I've heard of this, I don't know what to make of it. And it's always been my argument that there's our target audience. These are people who are interested in the human past. If all they have is ancient aliens and America on Earth, that's what they'll embrace because it's all they're exposed to. And so there's our target audience. But is that changing now? Is the world changing? And is the proportion of fence sitters decreasing, and the people at the ends of the tails of the curve, are those numbers increasing?
I think they are. I don't have a survey to back that. Of course, here's the problem. There has been recent people looking at surveys and starting to realize, like a good anthropologist should,
Right.
that surveys are not perfect tools. They do not. People have agency, and is becoming increasingly clear that there are things that people will answer on surveys as a form of being heard. Like, you can put conspiracy theories on surveys, and you can get sometimes shockingly high numbers. And those surveys, those answers seem to be in part, basically, to some degree, a way of, it's not terribly different than liking on Facebook. I think that's increasing how people are sometimes. So sometimes it's hard to tell, but then I think that gets to the fact that I do think there are less fence sitters, because I think, frankly, we are more polarized as a society than we were, say, 40 years ago. And there's actually
so many levels, yeah.
And there's a lot of evidence. There is actually a lot of real, both ethnographic and sociological, like, sort of survey, and not just survey, but census data and deep data. Like, I just was looking at that piece the New York Times put out, where they analyzed what TV shows people watched,
Right.
and where they voted and where they lived, and we're finding even polarization there.
Yeah.
And while it was not a perfect study, I suspect it's largely accurate, and it's not the first thing to show. And there have actually been studies, and maybe we'll see if we can find these for the show notes, that showed that other things used to show how you would vote. And increasingly, it is just coming down to a large degree to a lot of political ideology and a few other ideological things. We are more ideologically distinct than we once were.
No, I completely agree with you, because I know some of the studies that you're mentioning there. I couldn't recite them by heart, but I know that they're there. And I know that I've read some other things that support what you're saying.
I heard a thing.
You heard a thing?
See, I'm making fun of us now. But anyway, continue.
Right, no, I know. I mean, I'm being so vague. But we actually have show notes. You can check our links.
Yes, we will try to find those.
Yeah, we will. But I don't know if we are actually more or less polarized, or if we just have better data. You know?
I think it's a little of both. I think
we have the ability.
We have all of these to express ourselves more and on record. You know, we have the panopticon of Facebook and Twitter, like, recording all of our data, and I'm sure that will never be used against us.
Right.
But I think also, though, okay, now here I'm going to get a little on where I go with this. I think it has a lot also to do with transformations in the class structure of the United States. Bruce Trigger, who wrote History of Archaeological Thought, which is often kind of the go-to history of archaeological thought. It's well named. But like in theory classes, like if you want to know how archaeology has developed, especially archaeology, although he's global about it, he's not just in the Americas. There's also William Sabloff, but he has argued that archaeology and other professional sciences, and here you can look at the work of Adam Stout and others, rose to some degree as a reflection of the rise of a sort of educated meritocratic middle class, and the ideal that was a good thing. And if you looked around a lot of Western economies and societies, and especially the United States recently, say the last 30 years, especially the last 15, that's been on the decline.
You're
And
saying
a
the middle
lot of-
class is declining.
Well, I mean, the numbers kind of show that. In fact, I showed a lot of students in my Culture Diversity in the United States class last year journalism pieces showing how corporations knew this, how corporations were either increasingly going to brands that were either very low end or very high end. It's what's often referred to as the Red Lobster effect, where you either push your efforts downscale or you push them upscale, but not really kind of aiming at a center anymore. And there's a lot of elements. You can see it in things like gentrification. You can see it in terms of wealth inequality. You can see it in terms of how much it costs to live in a place like in San Francisco versus how hard it is to sell your house in a place like, pick a Rust Belt town in a Midwestern state. And I think this polarization is not unrelated to that.
And okay. You're so bleak. I'm sorry. I'm trying to come up with something positive to say after that. I don't really know if I have anything. But no,
well, I think it's a lay of the land thing. I think it's sort of a, here's what we have to work with, and I think we have to think about what we do accordingly.
No, and you're right. And there's been I hate to say it this way, but there's been like a dumbing down of, at least that I've seen, of America. And there's been several books written on this topic, and when I find the titles, I'll put them in the show notes. But there has been this like very vocal trend of anti-intellectualism, and I thought it was getting better there for a while. I was hoping it was getting better, but recent trends and recent events have kind of shown me that maybe that's not true. And again,
but that's not new though. That's not new. People talk about that for a long time.
It's not, but it is painfully obvious now. And that does kind of affect, like you were saying, with the decline of the middle class, and then this blatant anti-intellectualism. It affects things like education, and that education can affect things like people's ability to understand what a real news story is and what a fake news story is, and that can actually affect people's ability to discern pseudo-archaeology from real archaeology.
Sure.
There could also be there could also be this level of escapism that pseudo-archaeology provides to people, because researching how to write a fantasy novel, I came across some interesting articles that are like, the reason why people like to read fantasy and sci-fi as much as they do is because it provides escapism from a world that they believe is already bleak or rigged against them. And so they...
Right. Well,
go ahead.
What you just said was where I was going to go with this. To be very bipartisan...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Hang on. Both in the election that just happened, you had your two nominees, but there was a lot of attention on both the American left and the American right towards the idea, and both sides talked about this, of things being rigged. Right. You had the people who were following Bernie Sanders and the people who were following Donald Trump that were both using that rhetoric. And of course, we also saw this kind of anti-establishment sort of attitude earlier in Brexit in the United Kingdom, and we've seen it in other elections in the West. And I don't think that's unrelated to what I was talking about earlier. And I think you're right. And so we had talked a century ago things like a news story in the Grand Canyon, a town, or a lost continent and evidence for it that's completely made up in 1912. Well, a lot of the characteristics we're talking about economically were true then too. I mean, they called it the Gilded Age for a reason. Mm-hmm. And I think we're seeing things repeat a little. And I think you're right. I think there's an element of, if you don't feel as invested in the institutions because you feel a society is rigged, where it's not a meritocratic ideal, then yes, escapism is going to be more important. And whether a piece is informative or not, if you think things are rigged, there's an element of, well, what does it matter?
Sure, right. A bunch of years ago, an anthropologist, Elizabeth Bird, wrote a book about the supermarket tabloids. And one of the things, and this is I believe in the 1980s, and even then what she found was, she had a large sample size, is that many of the people who read the Weekly World News and the National Enquirer and the Examiner, that when asked about, but aren't these stories kind of absurd? There really isn't any evidence. A large proportion of people said, "Oh, we don't care. That's not important. This is interesting. It would be interesting if this were true, and so we're entertained by that, and that the truth or falsity was not even secondary. It was irrelevant."
Right.
Let's take a break, because I actually have something to kind of bounce off of that, like to kind of extend that idea when we come back, that gets it into our kind of our normal discussion of the paranormal and the fringe and all of that.
Super.
Telling a different story to the traditional lines of archaeology, the Archaeologist podcast seeks the stories and ideas that are often overlooked or not considered real archaeology. Video games, anarchism, and archaeology in the middle of hostile areas. Host Tristan doesn't search under the rocks. He destroys them. Available on iTunes every fortnight.
This podcast is sponsored by Ramp. Are you the decision maker in your company? Consider this. For the first time in decades, there's a better option for a corporate card and spend management platform. Meet Ramp, the only corporate card and spend management system designed to help you spend less money so you can make more. With Ramp, you get full visibility into your company's spending and control who spends what with each vendor. Ramp's software collects and verifies receipts instantly to save your team valuable time. Ramp automates data entry and routine tasks with automated approvals, expense categorization and bill payments, time-consuming tasks. Which means you'll stop wasteful spending and close your books in hours instead of days. Businesses that use Ramp add up to 5% to their bottom line the first year. If you're a decision maker, adding Ramp could be one of the best decisions you've ever made. Get $250 when you join Ramp for free. Just go to ramp.com/easy. Ramp.com/easy. ramp.com/easy.
Cards issued by Sutton Bank and Celtic Bank, members of FDIC. Terms and conditions apply.
Chicken tacos should only be trusted to chicken professionals.
That's where we come in. Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One comes with pico de gallo and creamy chipotle ranch. And the other comes with bacon, lettuce, tomato, and avocado ranch. Chicken experts since 1990. Chicken taco experts since now. Order yours today in the Zax Rewards app. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
Before the break, Ken was talking about the Elizabeth Bird study on tabloids and how it didn't seem to matter whether it was true or whether it was not. And that kind of struck in my head. I've heard elements of that before in paranormal and occult circles. And I want to say it was maybe Jacques Vallée in the UFO world. If it was not, I apologize. But this idea that UFOs are here to make us think. And I think that's actually how a lot of people interface with it. So on the one hand, I think some of these claims and ideas are there to support existing ideologies, whether it's nationalist or political or religious or whatever it is. And Sara covered some of that when she was talking about the book earlier. But I think for some people, this is kind of how they interface with how they think science works. And if you look at what's popular, when people link stuff that's archaeological, it's often things with a mythic resonance or the mystery attached. And people find it interesting. And they may care if it's real or not. I'm not sure how much they care, though. I think there's an element of, if it's true, that's great. If it's not, but wouldn't it be interesting if it was? And then they'll use that to spin off. Like the classic example here. How many of you have heard somebody, when asked if UFOs are real, their answer will be, well, it's presumptuous of us to believe that with all the stars out there and all the planets out there, that there must be intelligent life. And I'm like, I didn't ask you that. I asked you if UFOs landed in Nevada last week. That's not the same question, but people take it as an opportunity to talk about a larger cool idea.
Almost always. The same thing there, Jeb, is when we'll talk about hyperdiffusionism, whether or not folks got to the New World in antiquity. And you're asking for evidence, and what they'll say is, well, don't you think those people could have successfully navigated the Atlantic? And well, wait a minute, that's not what we're talking about, really. We're talking about, is there evidence that they did,
exactly,
whether or not it was plausible.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that's the thing. It becomes a place for people to explore these ideas. And they often then talk about it being against their textbook or against the experts. And I've talked about this before, but Jasmine Day and others have done studies of visitors to museums, to like Egyptology museums or Egyptological exhibits in museums, and how the thing is, people don't want to be lectured at. They want to do the exploring. But when they do the exploring, where they often fall back is on old colonialist tropes that don't necessarily have any place in reality. Mummies' curses and native guides and stuff like that. So on the one hand, there's this kind of, I want to be empowered. But then where that goes is, I'm just going to say a thing that has no basis in reality after about 1920.
Right, and that kind of goes back to that Victorian thinking that you've mentioned before, as basically the main tool of the fringe is they fall back on old documents to support ridiculous ideas in today's modern age.
And I think that gets back to that Gilded Age thing, and I think it gets back to that idea of not wanting to have faith in institutions. Because, again, the economic and social elements that we're looking at today, you see a lot of parallels a century ago. And at that time when professionalism was on the rise, you see a lot of efforts to kind of de-institutionalize, to de-legitimize institutions, experts, etc. And I don't think this is entirely neutral. I really don't.
And I'm not sure if we want to go this way right now, but for me, this brings to mind something we've been talking about before, not a fringe archaeology topic, but the recent designation President Obama gave to the Bears Ears National Monument, gave it national monument status.
This is in Utah, right?
This is in Utah, southeastern Utah. And how there was this consortium or coalition of archaeologists, of conservationists, of geologists, as well as Indian tribes, the Navi, the Navajo, the Hopi, the Zuni, and a couple of bands of the Ute Indians, who gathered together to support this nomination, preserving this almost 2 million acres. And Obama gave it, assigned it its designation as a national monument, and the response and the reaction from people against that, and it is this kind of rejection of what the institution of the National Park Service, the institution of the presidency, reaction against that, reaction against pointy-headed intellectuals, the rejection and reaction against American Indians. And I think we're seeing that in this case, that experts and people emotionally and spiritually invested in preserving this land are being mocked and being rejected for reasons that fundamentally are that speak to folks' economic considerations. And it's tragic, having been in the area. It is an absolutely stunning, beautiful area. Archaeological sites, cultural resources are one of the main factors involved in the nomination of this as a national monument and its designation as a national monument. So archaeological sites, rock art, and cliff dwellings, and great houses, and even sites even more ancient are all part of this, and that's why this area, which is all federal property anyway, is being designated a national monument. But again, it's the reaction against the institution, the reaction against the federal government, the Department of the Interior, Native American tribes, and academicians in archaeology and geology. Reaction, let's reject that nonsense so that we can drive our ATVs wherever we want, and we can conduct explorations for oil and gas wherever we want. And that's the sad thing is I'm not sure they will be able to rescind the nomination. They conceivably may be able to scale it back, and it's even possible that Utah could end up instituting regulations that will not allow a president to designate any more national monuments without the say-so of the congressional of the Congress. which is not part of the original law. So it's a mess. But again, it's this reaction against institutions, against universities, and against Native Americans.
See,
and that's not new. There have been attempts to try to scale back the Antiquities Act in this specific capacity in the last years. I've talked about it in my classes.
Yeah, we've talked about it on the Women in Archaeology podcast as well, and I'm pretty sure they've hit on it on the CRM podcast. So,
we'll include a link to the wording of the Antiquities Act. It's a very short law, and it's a very clear and explicit. The President of the United States has the power to designate an area as a national monument if he or she deems that to be the best way to manage those lands. And so President Obama was well within his legal rights to do this, but the reaction, and if you listen to the congressional delegation from Utah, they are convinced that with a Republican in the White House, they will be able to eliminate this, to put this on the scrap heap of history, along with the Affordable Care Act and any one of and regulations and so on and so forth. Again, the area is of special importance to me. I mean, I just absolutely love the Four Corners area in southeastern Utah. It's truly remarkable. The archaeological record there is so incredibly dense, and a lot of these places are open. For folks, tourists who are interested in American antiquity, to actually engage in these sites, to see these things for themselves, and anything that's going to help protect and preserve these for future generations, I'm all about that. And so the years long effort to get this place designated as a national monument has born this wonderful result, but I'm not absolutely convinced that there's not going to be a tremendous amount of blowback that's going to actually hurt conservation movement, hurt historic preservation movement, and I'm concerned about what the future holds.
Well, and I think this kind of comes around to what we were talking about at the beginning of the show, where I don't want to engage in like victim blaming, basically, but I feel like if the common person was more invested in and understood archaeology and the importance of cultural heritage better, I mean, yeah, you're still going to have people who are like, I want to drive my ATV all over everything because rawr. You're going to have those people, and I'm trying really hard not to get like super angry political right now. But I feel like that if people were just better informed on why the cultural heritage is important, it doesn't have to do with Native Americans versus white people. It's everybody's heritage. We all live here. That's part of America. We should maybe know something about it. And if people understood that once this is gone, it's not coming back, you can't recreate it. You can't just take a bunch of paintbrushes out there and paint pictures on the rocks again and woo, it's back and brand new. It's not how that works. I think if people understood that a little bit better, maybe they would be a little less against this whole like not making it. They'd be more open to preserving it, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
There's also a small part of me that just There's also a small part of me that wonders, like, with everything else that has happened over the last 8 years, if everybody just hates it because Obama said it.
I think there's some truth. I think there's some of that. And Obama and then a bunch of scientists.
Yeah, I mean,
rangers. And again, getting back to Ken's, like, the point he had at intellectuals. And you brought this up with the anti-intellectual thing as well.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, in the last 8 years, if Obama has breathed, then certain demographics of this country have been completely and utterly against it, And I can't wonder if that's not part of it.
Yeah. But I guess ultimately one of the goals of this podcast has always been, and will continue to be, maybe we'll accelerate this, to be proactive, to not just respond, to not just to debunk fake archaeology, but to kind of talk about why is this significant? Why is the Bears Ears area significant? Why is preserving archaeological sites significant? What can those places actually tell us about the human condition? And I'm hoping, maybe I'm being Pollyanna-ish, but I'm hoping that that if we can articulate to folks who are not archaeologists why they should care about this, that this is our collective heritage. It's not the heritage of only one group of people or another group. It's it's the heritage of all Americans, and it's something that we need to act towards preserving, so that our kids and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, everybody loves, kids and grandkids. That's what is important. So let's make sure that these places are there for them to see and enjoy and to learn from. That maybe we can have that positive impact, so that people will say, no, you know what? This is important. We understand why this is important, and let's act to preserve these places for the present and the future. And we'll just keep on doing that and hope we have that positive impact.
Well, and one of the things, getting to what this podcast is about, is, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, when we're talking about subsistence patterns, whatnot, that's all damn important. That gets really hard for people to listen.
Right.
The things that we do talk about on this show is actually when people listen. And a lot of people that are going to listen, or be interested in them, may never care what we say, because we are pointy-headed, intellectual, blah, 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 blah. But some won't. Sarah, you were saying, like, I hope if people will just know more, they might care more. There are a lot of people that are never going to. That's
right.
a reality.
I know.
Sure.
But there are some that will.
And like I was telling you earlier, I mean, I'm not trying to change the mind of the person who is set against me. I'm trying to put information into the hands of the people who are witnessing the conversation. I am perfectly okay with the fact that if I am talking to someone who is invested in their fringe beliefs, that I am not going to change their mind. What I am more concerned about is having a conversation that the people who are watching can follow and can easily say, okay, that was a rational argument, that was an irrational argument, this was evidence, that was the lack of evidence. And I want people to be able to walk away from that conversation and be able to make an informed decision from that conversation. And I think Ken kind of feels the same way, don't you, Ken?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, what I was going to say is my favorite conversations with students these days is when I ask them, well, how many of you guys watch Ancient Aliens? How many of you used to watch America Unearthed? And they would say, yeah. And I would say, well, those shows are bullshit. My favorite conversations are when they look at me and they say, oh, really? Why? So they're not invested in what those guys are saying. They just think, well, that's interesting. But when they hear somebody, in this case, a person in a position of authority, they're at the front of the classroom, who says, well, no, that's bullshit. And that sparks an interest in them to find out, well, why do you say that? Why do you think that? That's okay. And maybe then we can thank those shows for getting kids interested in the first place and bringing them into those intro archaeology courses, because they think it's going to be about ancient aliens and America Unearthed, and they find out, well, it's not, but here's why.
Well, I get a lot of that with my Lost Cities and Ancient Civilizations course because of that title. I will say this. I'm going to make not a prediction of something I think is guaranteed to happen, but something I suspect might happen. This is going to sound really weird. When Ken said he doesn't want to sound like a Pollyanna, and I'm like, I was trying to think of any context I would ever be accused of that.
No, it's not possible.
Well, here's one yes and no. I'm actually going to say things are going to get much worse in some senses, but I will say this. Given that we have seen an increase in kind of conspiratorial thinking and what we might refer to as the fringe in mainstream society recently, I do sometimes think that does actually have the effect of kind of limiting the audience of interest in more traditional bullshit.
Okay.
So I will actually make the suggestion that you might actually see a little less interest in things like ancient aliens and whatnot, in part because it's actually now closer in some ways to the mainstream discussion. And
terrifying.
That's not good in some ways, but like in other ways, that I'm just saying you might actually see that.
So what I've heard Jeb say here is that our show is now no longer going to be one of those fun little shows you listen to because you've got an hour to kill, but we have now become part of the mainstream media.
I've been saying this is a thing. I've been saying, again, when we talk about things, the stuff that we talk about, and like talking about conspiracy theory, talking about how the media ignores narratives that it finds too weird. That's what we've been doing for years, and all of a sudden everybody else is playing catch up.
Right. And you're correct. Like, one of my goals of the show was to make it be a little beacon of logic and a big sea of weird. And we, I think, have successfully done that in the past 2 years. And I hope as we're going forward that we will continue to be that beacon. And I didn't realize how important that would be in the upcoming 4 years, but it doesn't scare me. It actually kind of excites me a little bit because I'm like, yay, we're going to be we've become important enough for people to take notice.
Yeah, we sure as shit won't be lacking for topics this year, will we?
That is the God's truth.
No. Again, if you all go look at that blog post that Jason Colavito put up, the number of things. Again, it's all stale. It's all stuff we've all heard before.
It won't be in 6 months.
Good God. Oh God. Like I said, I went and read his previous one, and it was a little Pollyanna. It's like, oh, here's all these things, and then it's twice as long this year.
Yeah.
And it's crazy.
Yeah.
Well, Ken, final thoughts?
Final thoughts. I'm looking forward to another year. I mean, I think we've done good work on this podcast, and I know we've gotten a lot of good positive feedback from folks. And keep that feedback coming, and keep suggesting topics for us to cover. And we'll ignore most of them, but we'll focus. We'll respond to some of that.
We will ignore all but the strangest.
There you go.
Okay. In all fairness, we covered about a third of them.
All right. But it's been a pleasure. Love working with the both of you. And let's keep on trucking.
Jeb, final thoughts?
I think we've covered a lot of good stuff today. It's a little more freeform. We didn't cover one specific topic, but I think we kind of had to. One, second year. Two, a lot of this stuff is actually a lot more relevant. So a sort of foundational statement is not a bad idea.
Yeah, and this show was a little bit more political than we usually get into. We try to keep it lighthearted, but we do try to inform. And I think going forward, we're gonna have a fun year. I think we're gonna have a fun year in the future.
And send all those angry emails to Sara, and she'll respond.
That's true. You can reach us at archaefantasies@gmail.com. I promise a human being will at least look at your email. If you are writing to me an email just to be belligerent, I will not respond to you. But if you're writing to be friendly, I might say thanks. Guys, it was great having you on the show.
Awesome show, and we'll see you in the funny papers.
Yes, thank you.
All right, guys, bye.
As one will call. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeosuit Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher, and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archaefantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaefantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archaefantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at Archaefantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaefantasies. Thanks again for listening.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. We don't do dinosaurs.
This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Is your vehicle stopping like it should? Does it squeal or grind when you brake? Don't miss out on summer brake deals at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Chicken tacos should only be trusted to chicken professionals.
That's where we come in. Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One comes with pico de gallo and creamy chipotle ranch. And the other comes with bacon, lettuce, tomato, and avocado ranch. Chicken experts since 1990. Chicken taco experts since now. Order yours today in the Zax Rewards app. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.